Welcome back to the Obsession Engineering ZX10 project. It's time to change the fluids in the bike and get it ready to ride. The next bit on the agenda is to change the oil, so I have my finest washing up bowl underneath, 17mm spanner, bit of a crack, and any second now out will pour the old stuff. There we go, that's draining happily. And while that's draining, I can put some antifreeze in it and I can prime up the new oil filter. I'm going to be using a genuine Kawasaki oil filter because you don't change them that often. Is it worth trying to save a fiver on an oil filter? I'm also using the absolute finest oil available for your motorcycle, Motul 300V. We're on 1040 because that's standard for these bikes. This is almost that good, it's a little bit overkill for use on the road, but this bike may very occasionally get used for a bit of quiet track daying. So we are putting the absolute best stuff available in it. So I tend to just fill the oil filter up with a bit of oil first, and that lets it soak into the filter fibres, into the filter material. So when you go to start your bike for the first time with the new oil in, it's already got the filter fairly full, so it just, primes the system up a little bit quicker. The next thing to do is take the oil filter off. I have an oil filter socket, which as long as the filter's not been done up too tight, should undo it. And, oh, there we go. That's that coming off. When you take the filter off, you will end up with some oil over the sort of header pipes and bits, but with a bit of brake cleaner it'll clean up fairly easily. So I'll pull that off, let it drain a little bit, and then we'll screw the new filter on. So I've screwed the sump plug back in and I've put the new oil filter on, and you can see a load of the oil and bits out the old filter down there. So I'll give that all a blast off with some brake cleaner, and then we can put some new oil in to go with the new antifreeze. For filling up the cooling system, I'm going to be using Motul Moto Cool. It's excellent stuff again, and it just happens I'm a Motul dealer because I actually think it is the best stuff available. So I've got yellow stuff in there, and when I can find it, I've got green stuff in there. And what I'm going to do next is just spin it over on the starter a little bit with no fuel tank on it, just to start pushing some oil around it. And you can see already that's pulling oil down, so we're getting more air in it. So then I'm confident when we go for a proper start, we'll get oil pressure nice and quickly. Reconnecting the fuel tank is nice and simple. It's a little clip-on connector down there for the fuel. I tend to connect the fuel supply up first before I connect the electrical connector, just in case there's power to it, which there really shouldn't be, but this way you won't get fuel everywhere. So push on clip connector, nice and solid, electrical connector down here, and this is just a breather that as I lower the tank down I'll slide it onto this little tit. So that's it. I shall take the hammer out in a minute, we'll drop the fuel tank down, and we'll see if we can make fire inside. Here we go. Ignition on, fuel pump prime. What I want to see is the oil light go out really quite quickly once I've pressed the start button. The oil light going out before the engine's even started is an excellent sign that we've got plenty of oil pressure. So I've just let the oil sit for a little bit, and I've topped that up, so I'm happy with the oil levels pretty good. I will give it a full run up to temperature shortly. While I let the bike cool down a little bit so I can check its fluid levels, I'm just going to address a little bit of a wiring irregularity. The previous owner had fitted a nice Brembo RCS mass cylinder, and because he's fitted that, he's had to rearrange the brake light switch. And when he did that, he's cable tied the switch wiring and bits to the brake lines, and it's just not really as neat as I'd like. And where it clips onto this bracket, that's actually where the clutch is meant to clip onto it, and this should be round the back because the cables are meant to go round the back of the fork leg. So there's a bit of rearranging to do, but I think we can make it look a little bit tidier. So these are the connectors that were buried under quite a lot of electrical tape, and they're not the nicest connectors, so I'll probably snip those off and put some nice waterproof connectors on that look a little bit tidier, but I'm also going to unravel all of this, and I'm going to route it correctly round the back of the fork leg. So I've already loosened off the actual switch, so I can sort of feed everything where I want it. So it's already looking neater because I've routed the main cabling behind the fork leg, as it's supposed to be. But this is the brake light switch, and it's really quite long. So what I'm going to actually do is decide exactly where I want it and trim it down a bit. So my solution is a couple of bullet connectors that are just a little bit tidier, and I've also trimmed this down quite a lot. I could have probably actually got it even shorter, but it is useful to maybe sometimes have a little bit spare. So what I'm going to do is just tuck that in here, cable tie that out of the way, and that's another little bit done. So I'm happy with my cabling, it's nice and neatly tucked away. I've checked my fluid levels and the oil and water are tip top. So the next thing to do is start to put some fairing back on it. The nose cone was a bit of a faff to take off because there's lots of clips and bolts and electrical connectors and all sorts running behind it. Unsurprisingly, putting it back on was equally as awkward. Getting the top fairing on is slightly awkward. It's not just a case of doing those two bolts because you have to tuck a load of wiring underneath everything as well. And talking of wiring, the switchgear wiring from the left hand side was slightly routed wrong as well because it's meant to go around the back of the handlebar and didn't. So I've tidied all that away, tucked everything into here and just made it a little bit neater than when I first got it. So that's another bit tidied away. There is also a little trim panel under here that stops all the electrical connectors getting thrown out in the breeze. Right, I shall put the mirrors on and then play around with some of the electrical bits that hang around here before I can put the little trim panel on that has the indicator on it. Once we've got all that lot on, the side panels and belly pan are actually quite easy. To explain some of the awkwardness of fitting the top fairing, there is quite a lot of wiring involved because this electrical connector and this electrical connector clip onto a bracket that's inside the panel, and then in front of that is the immobiliser antenna bit that clips into here onto its own bracket. And then you also have the wiring that goes onto the headlights and indicators and all that stuff, as well as all the connections for the switchgear that all congregate in the top fairing down here. So yeah, there turns out to be quite a lot of wiring, and it all tucks behind different bits of the top fairing. So as well as actually trying to get the fairing to clip onto places, you've also got to try and get the cabling in the right place. It's a bit of a faff. Even fitting this little trim panel here that holds the indicator on is a bit of a faff because it bolts to this and it bolts to some of the brackets that bolt to this, and they have to be in exactly the right place to get all the bolts in the back, so it's just a bit of a palaver. I'm assuming what happened during the design phase was they tried to make the rest of the bike really quite small, and in doing that they ran out of room to put all the electrical connectors, so they've sort of tucked them all away here in the fairing, and I suppose most of the time you wouldn't notice. I'm certainly not planning on taking the fairing off again anytime soon. Fitting the left-hand side indicator panel is considerably easy because there's considerably less wiring down the left-hand side of the bike, but there is still a few little awkward tabs and brackets and bits. Oh, for the want of an easy fairing. So that's the top fairing back on, and it has been an absolute pig to do. Realistically, it was actually faster to do valve clearances than it was to take off a nose cone and put it back on. It shouldn't really be that difficult, but it just is. It's fiddly. I'm wondering if they employed somebody from Honda to redesign the fasteners and clips. So the next thing to do is to fit the side panels. But that means crash bung time. And I promised I wasn't going to put these back on, but the correct bolts have not turned up yet. I've had a bit of a brainwave, and yes, it has been a long day. I realised I had some brake caliper bolts that are the same pitch thread as the original engine mount bolts. Admittedly they're the wrong length, but I've used some of the mounting bits from the crash bungs to use the caliper bolts instead of the engine bolts. I have got the correct engine bolts on order, so they will get changed later, but this means I don't have to refit the crash bungs, which is an absolute blessing. Part of the issue with not refitting my crash bung though is there's a bit of a hole in the fairing panel, which is a little bit obvious. But Philip, who sits in the office behind me and plays on his computer all day, he claims it's real engineering, but I'm not so sure. He's got a 3D printer, so he's printed me this plug. The idea with this is, this will fit in the panel from behind, something like that, and yes, it isn't quite the right shade of black, as you can tell, but I do at home have some shiny black sticker vinyl, which if I cut just bigger than this, should fit in quite nicely, and at first glance at least you won't be able to see it. I'm hoping it'll look good enough that I won't have to repaint the panel, because it's expensive and getting the colour match right can be a pig. So that is my plan. Stick my plug in my hole, so to speak, and then I can put my panel on. Okay, I will admit, until I put something shiny and black over it, it is a little bit obvious, but there is a distinct advantage to it already. From here, you can't see it, and as I'm pushing the bike around to the workshop, I'm not going to hit my knee against it and really swear a lot out loud. So we're already winning with that. The side panel is nice and easy to put on. There's a couple of clips down the back of here that just push in, so I'll put a bit of grease on them, line all these up, a couple of tiny little tabs that tuck in, but really, for putting fairing on a motorbike, it's really quite simple. The polar opposite of the top fairing. Fitting the belly pan is an absolute joy compared to all the other panels. Just a couple of clips and a couple of bolts and she's on. After the right fun and games of putting the top fairing on, the side panels, belly pan and the seat unit bits are an absolute joy to put on. They take merely moments to do. The only slight game is the little trim panel for the seat. The other side, I've given it to my mate Adam to plastic weld because there's a crack up it from about there. So that's not ready yet, but it's not going to stop me actually riding the bike. The next thing to do is to change the handlebar grips though, because as good as Renthal ones are when you're on a racetrack, I don't really need them on the road. So I have some Kawasaki style ones to go on it, and they should take just a moment to change. My preferred technique for removing handlebar grips, you can just slice them off with a knife, but that sort of wastes them, and these are in decent condition so they could go in the spares box. So what I've done is unscrewed the bar end weight, get a long screwdriver and wiggle it up the hole, which I have to admit is easy when you've got two hands. Then I could lever that up a little bit, spray a bit of brake cleaner up the hole, and that sort of breaks any seal and lubricates it quite nicely, and then you can actually just wiggle it off by hand. And then you can reuse it if you really want to. So I have my new Kawasaki style grip. These are actually made by Ariete in Italy, but I do suspect they make them for Kawasaki because they are very similar. So I'm actually going to do the same thing to put this one on as I did to take the other one off. Good douse from a brake cleaner. There it is fitted. Real nice easy way to fit them. Once the brake cleaner sort of dries off, you'll find they actually grip the bar really pretty snugly. If you really want to, you can put glue inside them, but then you've got to make sure you get them on really quickly, otherwise you end up with your handlebar grip halfway off your tube. So that's the ZX10 back together. I've even given it a coat of polish to get my mucky fingerprints off it. I've had a once over around the chassis to make sure the brakes and the wheels and things aren't going to fall off, and I've put some chain lube on it for what appears to be the first time in 17 years. It will at some point be getting a chain and sprockets kit, but I want to ride it first and see if I like the standard gearing. They are geared quite tall standard, so it might well get shorter gearing on it. I'm also going to ride it first and see if I like the way the suspension works. They are supposed to be quite hard, and just pushing it at standstill, the suspension is decidedly firm in it. So I'm going to ride it first, see how entertaining it is, and then we'll look at putting tyres in it and revalving all the suspension. Thanks for watching, and join me again next time. We'll be on the road with the ZX10.